In the spring of 2011, the quaint district of Volga and nearby Ural, in the Russian Federation, saw a spate of killings that shocked the nation to its core. Killing sprees in which the victims were old single women, between the ages of 75 to 90 was practically unheard of in Russia. This is the story of one of the most prolific Russian serial killers to have terrorized the country for almost a decade. In March of 2011, a number of murders of elderly women were being reported in Volga and Ural federal districts in Russia. The victims were aged between 75 to 90 years and they were all single pensioners, who were mostly living in typical 5-story apartment buildings, called Khrushchevka. These apartments were built in the 60s under the Soviet regime, and were meant to be low-cost housing for the common folk. After the initial investigation, the local law enforcement came to the conclusion that the murders were being committed by the same killer. They based this after the fact that the killer in all these cases had the same MO. The women were all strangled to death with common household objects like belts and electric wires. And although the killer usually robbed his victims of money and some valuables, authorities believed that robbery was not his main objective, because in some cases, he had not taken money that was clearly lying in plain sight. According to the authorities, the killer usually gained access to the victims' apartments by trying to help the elderly women with their groceries, or by pretending to be an employee of the homeowners association, or social services. One of the victims had miraculously survived, but unfortunately she could not describe her attacker, forcing the police to resort to conventional methods of investigating. By the time detectives realized they had a serial killer on the loose, he had already killed 8 women and moved to a different region. He killed his 9th victim in the neighboring region of Mariel. But this time, he had an unexpected run-in. The killer was searching the victim's house for money when the woman's son suddenly entered the house, panicked. All the killer could think of doing was to jump out of the 2nd-storied apartment window. It is assumed that he might have suffered minor injuries, but it certainly didn't deter him from killing again. It's unclear whether the descriptions given by the victim's son helped the authorities in narrowing down the suspects, but this close call did have an effect on the killer's MO. After this incident, the killer only chose victims who lived on the ground floor, trying to play it safe. The killer seemed to have moved on to another region to find his next victim. He committed his next 3 murders in Udmurt Republic, and then returned to Tatarstan. His last confirmed killing happened in September 2012 in Bashkortostan. Finally, on September 26, 2012, the police caught a break. The killer was captured on a CCTV camera at the entrance of one of his victims' homes. Authorities were able to make a facial composite with the help of the CCTV footage. According to witnesses, the killer's MO, and the little evidence that could be gathered, a psychological profile of the killer was made. Investigators suggested the killer was male, between 25 to 30 years old in 2012, and was not ethnically Slavic, but probably Tatar or Udmurt. The psychological profile indicates that he's probably introverted, grew up without a father, lived with his grandmother whom he disliked. He probably lived in a Khrushchevka house. He must have graduated from high school, but was unlikely that he attended college. Investigators believe he must be a charming and amiable personality, since all the women let him inside their apartments willingly. Tatarstan police suspect that he is a native of Kazan, since the murders started there. At some point, the police speculated that he might be a healthcare professional or a social worker, and might have had access to a database listing of the elderly. Currently, there are 23 murders confirmed to be committed by the Volga maniac by DNA test, and another 9 believed to be committed by the same person because of matching MO. The last confirmed murder happened in 2012. On March 28, 2017, 37-year-old Kazakh native Pavel Shayakhmetov was arrested in Samara, on suspicion of involvement in the murders, as he had killed 2 elderly women in Samara on March 25 and 27, 2017. But authorities could not find any definitive evidence that Pavel was the Volga maniac. In 2017, authorities also interviewed school teachers in Kazan, hoping they would remember the killer as one of their students, but nobody could identify him. Russian investigators, with the help of law enforcement agencies from former USSR territories, concluded that there were no crimes matching the Volga maniac's MO in the surrounding countries. While it is possible that the killer moved to another country, it is not considered probable. Current reward for any information leading to the killer's arrest is 3 million rubles, or $47,000. On December 1, 2020, Russian investigators claimed to have caught the man known for years only as the Volga maniac. Russia's investigative committee said that the suspect, a 38-year-old man named Radik Tagirov, confessed to a string of 26 murders of elderly women that had terrorized central Russia between 2011 and 2012. He was identified using DNA evidence, shoe prints, and other evidence from crime scenes. Though the investigation into Tagirov's confession is still in its early stages, Russian authorities seem to be confident that they have caught the Volga maniac. Whether or not Tagirov will be convicted of his crimes and brought to justice is still to be seen, but hope remains in the hearts of the people that the terror of Volga maniac has finally come to an end, and with it, peace to the families of the victims. What are your thoughts on the Volga maniac? There are a few names that come to mind when we think of real-life serial killers, such as Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. But there is one name that strikes fear especially in the hearts of women more than others, and that is of Samuel Little, one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. On June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, Samuel Little was born to a sex worker. He was raised by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. His early childhood was troublesome, and he had always had disdain for authority figures. Having lived in an impoverished neighborhood, Little was exposed to violence and crime, which was commonplace. Little was not a great student at high school, and was reproached several times due to disciplinary issues. Little began committing crimes in his teen years. In 1956, he was detained at an institution for juvenile offenders, after being convicted of breaking and entering into a property in Omaha, Nebraska. His crimes started getting progressively worse after his first run-in with the law. Samuel Little's crime spree boasted of many different crimes including driving under the influence, fraud, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. He was arrested more than 25 times in 11 different states, and while in prison, he was known to have been a violent inmate, and he claims to have learnt boxing there. He even referred to himself as a prize-fighting boxer, a career which he never pursued. According to the FBI, Little started killing way back in 1971, but due to lack of any substantial evidence, most of the murders that Little claims to have committed were never tied to him. The first time Little was arrested on murder charges was in 1982 in Pascagoula, Mississippi. He was charged with the murder of 22-year-old Melinda Rose Lepre, who went missing in September of that year. And while he was under investigation, Little was transferred to Florida for the trial of another murder, that of 26-year-old Patricia Ann Mount. Many witnesses had come forward to give their statements, but Little was eventually acquitted as the testimonies made by these witnesses were mistrusted. Little's victims mostly tended to be women of color, who belonged to the fringes of society. They were sex workers, drug addicts and homeless women who had little to no protection against violent offenders such as Little. He had once claimed that he never killed any senator or governors or fancy New York journalists, but only those who lived and worked in the ghettos. His insane justification for his crimes went on, as he even said that he believed to have been commissioned by God to kill his victims to put them out of their misery. To this day, the majority of the victims remain unidentified, and many of their deaths were attributed to natural causes, drug overdoses or accidents. Little's method of killing started out by punching his victims out cold and then strangling them to death. With no bullet or stab wounds, it was difficult to detect foul play. The LAPD gave him the name the choke and stroke killer, since he often masturbated while strangling his victims. In October 1984, Little was arrested for kidnapping, beating, and strangling 22-year-old Lori Barros, who survived. 1 month later, he was found by police in the backseat of his car with an unconscious woman, also beaten and strangled, in the same location as the attempted murder of Barros. Little served 2.5 years in prison for both crimes. Upon his release in February 1987, he immediately moved to Los Angeles. Of course, his killing spree did not end there. Little went on to kill many more women over the course of the next 2 decades. Little was arrested at a Kentucky homeless shelter in September 2012 and extradited to California, where he was wanted on a narcotics charge. Once Little was in custody, Los Angeles Police Department detectives obtained a DNA match to Little on the victims in 3 unsolved homicides from 1987 and 1989 and charged him with 3 counts of murder. For these crimes, Little was convicted and sentenced in 2014 to 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. In all 3 cases, the women had been beaten and then strangled, their bodies dumped in an alley, a dumpster, and a garage. Little asserted his innocence throughout his trial, even as a string of women testifying for the prosecution told of narrowly surviving similarly violent encounters with Little. A few months after his sentencing, the police said that Little was being investigated for involvement in 36 murders committed in the 1980s, which until then had been undisclosed. In connection with the new circumstances in Mississippi, the La Pree murder case was reopened. In total, Little was tested for involvement in 93 murders of women committed in many U.S. states. Little's killing spree had come to end after his arrest in 2013, but later investigations revealed that he had killed more than 90 women all over the country. This was a startling discovery that only came to light because the FBI enlisted his information in its Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, which began finding strong links between his movements throughout the decades to a slew of unsolved murders across 19 states. Although Little's memory of dates and what his victims were wearing at the time of their murders are not entirely accurate, he seems to have maintained an acute memory regarding other details. The FBI stated that he remembers where he was, and what car he was driving. He even drew pictures of many of the women he killed. In 2018, while Little was being held in a California prison, Texas Ranger James Holland visited him in hopes of solving a 1994 murder of a prostitute named Denise Brothers in Odessa, Texas. Little ended up confessing to the murder and many more in exchange to be transferred out of LA County Prison. Learning that Little had a talent for drawing, Holland provided him with art supplies so he could illustrate his victims. Since then, Little has produced impressively accurate portraits of his victims, which the FBI is currently using in hopes of solving several dozen cold cases. Over the course of almost 2 years, Little shared detailed information about each of his victims, how he killed them and the general location of their bodies. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020, at the age of 80 in a Los Angeles prison. He never did show remorse for his heinous crimes, and always seemed to victimize himself when he spoke of the murders. Before his death, he once told a New York magazine reporter that he now lives in his mind with his victims, who he referred to as his babies. The FBI have so far verified at least 50 of Little's murder confessions and are still in the process of corroborating more than 40 other cases. But this task will be more challenging now that Little has died. The FBI created a web page listing the details Little shared with detectives, his drawings, where he believes each woman was from, and Little's videotaped confessions. Detectives hope that with the public's help and the information from Little, they can resolve the remaining 40 unresolved cases. Thank you for watching, and we hope you found our video interesting. Like, comment and subscribe for more fascinating unsolved mysteries.